Alright, so we have a new article that came out written by Joel Wagler over at winteriscoming.net, and he's discussing some of the issues the Wheel of Time show might be facing in production, and I thought it was a fairly interesting article, and we should go ahead and dive on into it. So I'm going to go ahead and read through it. I'm also going to link to it down below, so if you want to read it yourself, go right ahead. But if you want to know my thoughts on some of the points made here, go ahead and watch this video right along with me. So he starts off by saying, Amazon, along with Sony Pictures Television, Red Eagle Entertainment, gross, Radar Pictures is developing a television adaptation of Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. While this sounds like great news for fantasy fans, there are a lot of hurdles to overcome before this fantasy becomes a reality. A decent opening. I'm not mad about it, and let's see how he explores this. As a potential heir to Game of Thrones' crown, A Wheel of Time shows a few advantages. For example, unlike Thrones, the Wheel of Time novels are finished. When Thrones premiered in 2011, author George R.R. Martin had completed 5 of the projected yada yada yada. Just basically saying that, yes, it's complete. You can plan it out like you should be able to for most shows. And again, that's fine. He then goes on to say, however, the sheer size of the Wheel of Time could present its own issue. Jordan's series is massive, 14-tome epic. 15 if you count the prequel. We're not going to because they're not doing that. With many of the installments topping over 700 pages in hardback, how many seasons of television would that require? Well, we've talked about this on my channel a bit before, but the consensus among you guys seems to be fairly simple. Basically, 2 books per season, and maybe certain books get their own season because there's certain books where an awful lot happen, most notably the last book, Memory of Light. Admittedly, Jordan's writing style makes the books seem more eventful than they are. Jordan was a true wordsmith, but many of his long, in-depth descriptions, so important to painting a picture in the mind's eye, can be visualized in seconds on film. I'm a little confused by his wording there. I think what he meant was his writing style basically inflates the books, not makes it seem like they're more eventful. Description is not an event. This is really the only real technical writing issue I had with this article, but saying eventful and then going on to say Robert Jordan describes things a lot is a little weird, but I do agree with the overall point that Robert Jordan describes many things, and if you took out his descriptions, they'd be like 30-page books. But while some of the middle books might be combined into a single season of television, that's what we just said, others will strain the edges of the format. In the Wheel of Time, every character, every scene, every conversation all serve a purpose, even if their importance may not become clear until later. That's just blatantly false. It's a weird claim to make as a writer. No, the Wheel of Time is not every single word hugely important, not every conversation. There's many that can be tossed and worked around, and I would say Robert Jordan is even a writer who has a little bit more conversations that are just purely based on fleshing out an aspect of a character, re-examining an aspect of a character that's already been established to the reader. We actually go through many redundant character moments at times. There's just, okay, yep, it's Matt doing Matt stuff again, and those things can certainly be cut and have no wider implications down the road. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying these are bad scenes or harm the series. They're really fun, good scenes, but I'm just saying in the wider context, they're not developing the character further. They're not hinting at something down the road. They're just good character moments. They're solid ones. And I'm not saying they should cut those scenes, but I'm saying there are ones that could be cut without hurting the wider story. Amazon will have a difficult time deciding what to cut and what to keep. Very fair. Even with judicious culling, it would be a challenge to squeeze the story into 10 seasons, and some seasons might need 12 or 13 episodes to do justice to the source material. You're absolutely right there. It's going to be a challenge. Casting. There are about 15 characters in the Wheel of Time series who could be considered leads. Fair number. I might cut it down a little more because I consider Nynaeve up could be considered a lead in amount of time devoted to them. I don't think there's 15 characters with more page time than Nynaeve, though I could be wrong. Not really saying you're wrong here, just a consideration to each their own point. There are another 24 or so who seem imperative to the story and dozens more who play sizable roles. Casting the right people for all these roles would be incredibly important to the long-term success of the series, with one miscast potentially meaning disaster. That puts a lot of of pressure on the casting department. That's assuming we don't cut down on roles and combine characters, something I've proposed before, especially with The Forsaken. The books are extremely character-driven, true, and unlike Game of Thrones, most of the characters are not morally ambiguous. This is a story about heroes. Yes, there are plenty of villains, but most of the main characters are decent people working for the greater good. More Jon Snow than Varys. The actors who play them all will need to be spot on with their interpretations. I agree with the larger message, but I think it was oversimplified to the point where it's actually detracting and not giving Wheel of Time enough credit. Yes, we're following heroes and good people, but the story is about these good people going through the hardest of times and being pushed to the edge, pushed towards the shadow in some really dark, disturbing ways. Minor spoiler, but Rand, most notably, obviously, gets pushed closest to the shadow frequently. It's about how much can friendship, relationships, and individuals take when going through these incredibly difficult times. Just saying it's a story of heroes doesn't quite match. It's much more about a story of corruption, temptation, and fighting against those things. It's about a hero's struggle in a way that I think just saying the classic fantasy, oh, they're heroes trope, doesn't give full justice to, but I'm being very nitpicky here. Locales, settings, and costumes. With over a dozen unique kingdoms, countries, and other peoples to visit in the novels, Amazon will have a large task building sets and finding locations. Few of these fictional locations share physical similarities, but I imagine compromises could be made for TV. Absolutely right. It might not be exaggerating to say this could be the most difficult thing to shoot in terms of locations and cultures presented in the history of television. This series will also feature multiple points of view from various locales simultaneously. These various locales will always be changing throughout the series, so the issue of how to deal with possible multiple sets, crews, shoots, the series needs to be addressed before production can start. Yeah, that's going to be huge, and it'll probably end up being a mixture of green screen and practical locations because certain things, it just won't make sense. Yes, in California, you could probably find a location that looked like the Aiel Waste, just go out to the desert and you'll be all right. But then turning around in the same season, having something like the Sea Folk happening, a little difficult, and they're going to be moving a lot of people around. And I fully expect to see a lot of green screen at the interpretation of Wheel of Time will be beginning. I've accepted that, and I'm moving on. Jordan uses distinct manners of speech and dress to distinguish the different nations in his books from one another. The show will acquire a critical mass of talented costume designers. If the goal is to mirror the books as closely as possible, the cost of personnel and materials will be an issue. Yeah, it will, and I'm hoping Amazon throws Wheel of Time a similar budget they just did to Lord of the Rings, because when it comes to the practical things you can't really fake with a green screen, like actual outfits the actors are wearing, there's going to need to be an insane budget. He's right on the money here. We're going to need that $500 million season budget that we're seeing Amazon give to Lord of the Rings. Special effects and magic. While Game of Thrones keeps its story pretty grounded in the reality of medieval times, the Wheel of Time relies more on magic. That's not to say there aren't battles where swords and shields cross and clang, but magic plays a huge role in the general storyline, with characters often traveling by magic means. You said by twice. It says by magic means. You might want to fix that. The script writers will have to be diligent in explaining how these things are done so they make sense when the audience sees them on screen. It also means that the Wheel of Time TV show will rely heavily on special effects, and the producers will have to think about how to implement them in a convincing way. There are no wands or hand gestures. Most of the magic in the series is performed mentally, with only the results visible. Agree and disagree. People still gesture quite a bit, even though they don't have to. People still just do it. So there is that, and I do think they're going to make the decision to just show us, the audience, the magic, especially later on in the series when most of our main characters are using it or are familiar with being around it. Hiding it in that sense would really contribute nothing to the show. Early on, maybe hide it and don't show it when our main characters that we're following aren't super familiar with it. But Robert Jordan actually had a clear vision for channeling. He had a lot of input for the New Spring graphic novel and how channeling was illustrated there. And after seeing that and reading that, I don't think it'll be as hard as many people predict. It seemed Robert Jordan just had different strands of very solid-looking light interweaving, and that's not too hard to generate on a computer. A lot of YouTubers out there could probably do it. It's the effects and results of that magic that'll be a bit more difficult. But then, we've seen fire look really good through CG, and all the other things like gateways can be done with editing fairly reasonably. There's even tutorials on YouTube, once again, just using After Effects, you can duplicate the Doctor Strange gateway. More of these practical magical effects, I don't think will be nearly as hard as people think, and I'm actually not as worried. Magic's been done since early Harry Potter days and only gotten much better since, so I don't think it'll be that big a budget of the CGI, and some of it could be practical, which would be pretty cool. And of course, what fantasy story worth its salt would be complete without its fair share of horrifying beasts? There may not be many dragons in Wheel of Time, but the designers and CGI artists will have their plates full with a number of hideous imagined creatures. Yeah, this is again something the author is right on the money with. The Trollocs and Murdral, I really do believe should be practical effects, because while things like magic that are fantastical can look pretty good on screen, often fleshy things still don't. Looking at you, Grand Moff talking. Recreating actual flesh with CGI, the Hobbit prequels, again, the orcs don't look nearly as good as the practical effects that were done over a decade earlier in the Lord of the Rings movies. So I am personally hoping they go practical effects and they put more of their money in that than anything else there. Production details and questions. To do these books justice, the production will have to climb many mountains. Are Amazon and its partners, along with showrunner Rafe Judkins, up to the task? Can they stay true to the books and make money? Can this series be made without long, frustrating gaps in production? Will the episode lengths and the lengths of the seasons fluctuate or stay consistent? If Amazon and their partners decide to go ahead with this project, you have to think they will be all in on making it spectacular. If done correctly, Wheel of Time series could be at least as big as Game of Thrones. Audiences have proven they are willing to follow these types of characters and storylines to the end. Many wish Game of Thrones wasn't ending after 8 seasons. If Amazon can stir up enough enthusiasm both among Wheel of Time diehards and people new to the series, this could be something special. Hopefully Amazon will greenlight the project soon, so there will be as little time between TV, fantasy, epics as possible. The time to strike is now while the iron is blazing hot. Overall, it's a good article, and I agree with many of the points made. A couple criticisms here and there, but no real misinformation being put out that's really misleading fans. I actually do believe Wheel of Time has a larger audience appeal than Game of Thrones, with Game of Thrones being so dark. I know many people who didn't watch it because of that, even though it has one of the largest TV audiences of all time. And I think that if done perfectly, which it won't be, but if it was done perfectly, Wheel of Time could overscope it. But the fact that it's coming second hampers that. There are going to be people, even though Wheel of Time came out first, who continually say that they're just biting off Game of Thrones, they're ripping it off, which, depending on how they execute the TV show, they could do in a couple of ways, especially if they manipulate the Wheel of Time to be in that darker vibe. Overall, I like the article. It does some pretty good things, and I'm hoping we see more articles like this in the future so we can get more buzz around the Wheel of Time series. That's why I'm talking about it. That's why I'm continuing to make Wheel of Time videos. I'm hoping Amazon sees an increase in attention, an increase in love, so that we can all enjoy it going forward. Amazon recently put out a tweet actually asking, like, which of our shows coming down the road are you most looking forward to? And they listed a bunch of their potential shows, and they didn't include Wheel of Time. A lot of the comments or retweets and replies were saying Wheel of Time. And as a diehard fan, that meant a lot to see. Anyway, guys, I hope you like this video. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace.